he defines you. How has that been for you?
Well, at first it was very difficult. You start losing yourself and who you are. People always wanted to know, and still do actually. I mean, I do understand it a lot better now than I did, let's say, when I was younger.
You grew up with the picture: jumpsuits, pompadours, gilded Graceland gates, and a fairy tale bride, the king of rock and roll, and his perfect wife. But I should inform you now that fairy tales have footnotes, and sometimes those footnotes tell the messier truth. Today, we're pulling those footnotes into the light. We're talking about how a teenager became Mrs. Presley, what it was like to live inside Elvis's orbit, and how decades after the divorce, Priscilla quietly laid out the realities of life with the king. This is the whole story: the glamour, the controlling moments, the heartbreak, and the things she finally said out loud. How did this fairy tale even start? And why does it look so different from the inside? The Priscilla before the Presley. Before she was the woman standing next to Elvis in those perfect wedding photos, Priscilla Beaulieu was just a quiet, shy kid who moved way too often and never really felt rooted anywhere. Her father died in a plane crash when she was just 6 months old. Her mother remarried a military officer, and that meant Priscilla grew up living the military family shuffle. New cities, new bases, new schools, new friends she'd have to leave again. By the time she hit her early teens, she'd learned how to blend in, stay polite, keep her emotions tucked inside, and adapt to whatever environment she was placed in. And that little detail, that ability to adapt, it becomes very relevant later. Priscilla wasn't some wild child or spotlight chaser. Everyone who knew her said she was soft-spoken, dreamy, and very sheltered. She played the piano, loved books, kept to herself, and lived in a world where adults made all the decisions. She didn't drink, didn't party, didn't push boundaries. She was raised to be well-mannered, agreeable, and respectful, the kind of girl adults bragged about because she never gave us any trouble. And that's who she was when, at 14, she showed up in West Germany. Another military move she didn't ask for, another life she had to adjust to. She had no idea her entire future was about to change, or that a global superstar was just a few miles away. And she most definitely had no clue she was about to be pulled into a universe that would swallow her whole. How does a quiet teenager living on a military base suddenly end up in the orbit of the biggest star in America? Elvis Presley, where his story really began. Before the rhinestones, the Vegas residencies, and the insane screaming crowds, Elvis was just a poor kid from Tupelo, Mississippi. He grew up in a tiny shotgun house with a mother he adored, and a father who spent a little too much time in trouble. Money was tight, options were limited, and fame was literally the last thing anyone expected from the shy boy with the soft voice. But Elvis didn't stay small for long. By the time he hit his 20s, he wasn't just famous, he was Elvis. The hips, the voice, the attitude, the dangerous image that made parents throw a side eye. Girls were fainting. Boys were imitating him. Hollywood wanted a piece, and so did the music industry. Everybody wanted something from him, including the military, apparently, because right at the peak of this madness, the military drafted him. Newspapers treated it like the second coming of Christ in a uniform. Fans cried like the world was ending. But Elvis went, and Germany became his temporary cage. Quiet, controlled, and suddenly very isolating. He was rich, famous, lonely, heavily monitored, dealing with the pressure of staying relevant, and mourning his mother, the one person he trusted most, who had died right before he shipped out. He was heartbroken, isolated, bored, and vulnerable. And what happens when a lonely superstar meets a sheltered teenager who's kind, gentle, and nothing like the chaos of his fame? Their first meeting. Elvis didn't meet Priscilla casually. She didn't run into him at a cafe. She didn't stumble into fame. There was no meet-cute moment here. She was invited to a small gathering at his home in Germany by someone who very much knew Elvis had a type. Young, sweet, quiet girls who wouldn't challenge him, wouldn't question him, and wouldn't disrupt the atmosphere he liked to control. Priscilla walked into the house wearing a sailor-style schoolgirl dress, and not because she was trying to look cute. That was literally what she'd worn to school earlier. She was 14, a child, and she looked exactly like one. Meanwhile, Elvis was 24, already a global sensation, already the kind of man who could walk into any room and instantly own the air in it. People love to gloss over this part, like the age difference was some harmless little footnote, but Priscilla herself has admitted it. The way he looked at her was not the way a man looks at an equal. He looked at her like she was something delicate, untouched, something he needed to protect and shape. Emphasis on shape. They talked. He played music. He told her stories about missing his mother, about the pressures of fame, about things no grown man should be unloading on a 14-year-old girl. And she was starstruck, not just by the celebrity, but by the vulnerable side of Elvis he always knew how to weaponize. He wasn't used to someone hanging on to every word. She wasn't used to anyone making her feel like the center of attention. It was a match made in mutual vulnerability. During that first gathering, they exchanged small talk, including comments on her age. At one point, Elvis leaned in, smiled, and said, "Why, you're just a baby." And that's the thing. He knew exactly how young she was. He wasn't confused. He wasn't mistaken. He acknowledged it out loud. After a few visits to the house, things escalated. On the third visit, Elvis took Priscilla upstairs to his room, away from the laughter, away from the adults, away from the people who might have raised an eyebrow. And that's where they shared their first kiss. She later said she felt overwhelmed, but Elvis reassured her the way only someone with complete control of a situation can. He told her, "We have plenty of time, little one." That right there? That was the moment the tone of their entire relationship was set. Soft, gentle, slow, controlled, on his timeline, in his world, with his rules. From that day forward, Elvis made it very clear he wanted her around, at his parties, at his house, in his orbit. And Priscilla, who had grown up following rules, followed his. Her stepfather hated it, and her mother wasn't thrilled either. They saw the age gap and the superstar status. They knew this was not some normal teenage crush. But Elvis was Elvis. He had charm, fame, money, and a practiced ability to win people over. He promised structure, responsibility, and rules. He basically presented himself like the world's most well-behaved babysitter, which really should have been a red flag all by itself. He agreed to give a full itinerary for every visit, where Priscilla would be, what time she'd be home, who was watching her, and when she'd call to check in. He agreed she'd be chaperoned at all times and she'd stay in constant contact with her parents, updating them like she was reporting to mission control. And you know what? It worked. He sold them the fantasy of safety under his wing, and slowly, painfully slowly, they gave in. Now, the question becomes, what exactly did Elvis want from someone so young, so impressionable, and so easy to shape? Elvis's puppet string years. Once Priscilla moved into Elvis's orbit, everything about her began shifting. Not because she wanted it, because he encouraged it, suggested it even. He complimented certain looks and discouraged others. It wasn't a makeover. It was molding. She was barely 15 when he started guiding her appearance. The black hair? His idea. The heavy eyeliner? Also Elvis. The clothes that made her look older, more glamorous, more mysterious? Straight from the king's personal preferences. Elvis didn't just decide her clothes or makeup. He subtly steered who she could spend time with. Friends he deemed too loud or outspoken, off limits. Friends who mirrored his image of the perfect girl, encouraged. Priscilla later admitted it felt like her social life was curated by a kingpin. Priscilla talked about it later, how she started losing the sense of who she was because she spent so much time becoming the girl Elvis wanted to see. It wasn't malicious, but it was controlling. And because she was young and in love, she thought this was normal. Because, honestly, who was she at the age of 14? It is important to remember that she didn't grow up with a strong sense of autonomy. She wasn't encouraged to assert herself or taught to question anything. So when Elvis said, "I think this looks good on you," she wore it. When he said, "You look prettier with your hair like this," you bet she did it. And when he said, "You should be this kind of woman," your guess is as good as mine. And while the world was fantasizing about their romance, Priscilla was quietly losing pieces of herself. What kind of life does a girl live when she becomes the project of one of the biggest stars in the world? To answer that, we have to step behind the gates of Graceland, where the real story begins. Graceland, the castle that didn't feel like home. Priscilla officially moved into Graceland in March 1963, just shy of her 18th birthday. It wasn't some grand, sweeping moment either. It happened slowly, almost like everyone involved knew how delicate the situation looked if you stared at it too long. Her parents tried to keep things respectable by having her stay with Elvis's parents at first, but that arrangement didn't last. Before long, she was moving pieces of her life into Graceland, while Elvis was off in California shooting movies. And here's the part people love to gloss over. She didn't live there full-time right away. She was still finishing high school, staying at that small house on Dolan Street, trying to balance exams with the reality of being tied to one of the most famous men in America. When she was at Graceland, she was usually supervised by Elvis's grandmother, Minnie Mae, because Elvis himself was rarely home. It was a transitional period, not quite a fairy tale, not quite independence, just a 17-year-old figuring out her place in a world that moved faster than she could. Moving into Graceland, Priscilla wasn't stepping into a palace. She was stepping into Elvis's world, one where his schedule dictated everything. He slept all day. He lived at night. Everyone in the house followed suit. If Elvis wanted to ride motorcycles at 3 a.m., people got up. If Elvis wanted to talk until sunrise, people stayed awake. If Elvis wanted the entire house silent, it went silent. Priscilla was still a student at this point, a teenager who had to be up for school, but she still tried to match his rhythms. She'd nap in class because she'd been up all night keeping Elvis company, and the man she was trying to impress? He was disappearing deeper into dependency, sleeping pills, mood stabilizers, uppers, downers, whatever kept him functioning. Graceland wasn't glamorous. It was chaotic, unpredictable, and exhausting. Priscilla had no authority in that house. She didn't run, control, or decide anything. Her life was a reflection of his whims. Which brings us to something people still whisper about. How do you hold a marriage together when one partner is living a fantasy and the other is just trying to keep up? Because once they got married, the cracks that were already there, they turned into full earthquakes. The marriage and the loneliness inside it. When Elvis and Priscilla finally tied the knot on May 1st, 1967, Priscilla was 21 and Elvis was 32. The whole thing looked like a fairy tale on paper, but Priscilla's actual experience wasn't nearly as effortless as the photos suggest. The ceremony barely lasted 8 minutes. 8! And it happened in a private suite at the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas, which tells you everything about how tightly controlled that day really was. She had the dress, he had the tux. The cameras were waiting, and before she could even process the moment, they were ushered into a press conference and then a reception that cost around $10,000. Priscilla has always described the day as surreal, glamorous, yes, but packed with pressure. Elvis's team planned every inch of it to keep the media from turning their wedding into a spectacle, which ironically made it feel even more orchestrated. They removed the word obey from her vows because Elvis didn't like the sound of it. The two of them had also decided to wait until the wedding night to consummate the marriage, which added its own kind of tension to the whole build-up. After the whirlwind in Vegas, they escaped to Palm Springs for their honeymoon at a mansion straight out of a magazine spread. And while it all looked like a storybook ending, the truth is Priscilla was stepping into a life where the romance was always paired with the weight of Elvis's fame and the expectations that came with being Mrs. Presley. Reality hits hard when the honeymoon glow fades. Elvis wasn't home. He was working, filming, touring, surrounded by temptation from sunrise to sunset. While Priscilla tried to play the role, the elegant wife, loyal partner, the woman who smiled while people gossiped about Elvis and his co-stars. She pretended it didn't hurt, that she didn't know. She pretended she was fine. But behind the quiet, she was lonely. The kind of loneliness that sits in your bones. She later admitted that, at times, she felt more like an accessory than a partner. Something shiny the world admired, but not someone whose feelings mattered. So naturally, people started asking, why didn't she leave? But Priscilla has said it herself. She was raised to please, to support, to endure, to be the good girl. And she loved him, not the icon, but the man who talked to her when she was 14, grieving his mother and searching for something real. So the real question becomes, what finally pushed her to walk away from the king? The unraveling. For Priscilla, married life with Elvis was never simple, and it only got more complicated the moment she became a mother. Lisa Marie was born in 1968, and while many would assume that having a baby would bring a couple closer together, that wasn't how it played out for her and Elvis. Priscilla expected things to change, a new chapter, a fresh start, maybe even some sense of normalcy in the chaos that was Graceland life. Instead, she discovered something she hadn't anticipated: distance. Elvis, for all his charm and larger-than-life persona, had a very particular vision of womanhood, one that heavily mirrored how he viewed his own mother. Mothers, in his mind, were to be adored, respected, and placed on a pedestal. Intimacy seemed to fall outside the rules. And so, after Lisa Marie was born, Priscilla experienced a profound emotional and physical disconnect from the man she had married. He wasn't cruel, he just seemed detached. The connection they had when she was younger, when he was sharing his vulnerability, and she was soaking it up like a sponge, had quietly slipped away. And while she grappled with this new distance, Elvis's career was pulling him further and further from home. He was filming movies, touring the country, and attending late-night functions. Life was moving at an exhausting pace that left Priscilla alone much of the time. Long absences became the norm, not the exception. And hovering over it all were the rumors. Co-stars, dancers, actresses, women who didn't have to fight for his attention because they were already shining under the spotlight he dominated. It was a constant reminder that, despite being his wife, Priscilla was only ever part of a much larger orbit. Elvis absolutely stepped out during the marriage. Priscilla tried to keep the peace, but the truth was, the moment he hit those Vegas stages in '69, temptation had him in a chokehold. And he didn't exactly fight it. Women were practically tripping over themselves to get near him, and he was saying yes a little too often for anyone's comfort, including hers. Priscilla wasn't clueless either. She started getting these handwritten letters from women basically bragging about their little moments with Elvis. Imagine checking your mail and finding fan mail from the side chicks. She also connected the dots on her own, because after a while the pattern was too loud to ignore. She later tried to be gracious about it, calling Elvis a good husband, and then casually adding, "There were just too many of us," which honestly tells the whole story. But the cracks really started showing earlier than people think. In late '67, Elvis suddenly asked for a trial separation, while Priscilla was pregnant. Picture that emotional whiplash, carrying his child, glowing, hopeful, and then, boom, he wants space. For a girl who'd been trained her whole life to stay quiet and loyal, it planted a seed she didn't even realize was growing. Because during that separation, Priscilla stepped outside the marriage too. Not in the same wild rock star way Elvis did, no backstage flirtations or hotel room rotations, but something much smaller and more emotional. She had a brief affair with her karate instructor, Mike Stone. Not to get revenge or be scandalous, but because she needed to feel chosen again. After years of living in Elvis's shadow, being molded, instructed, and monitored, she wanted to feel seen for once, not as Elvis's wife, but as Priscilla. And here's where both worlds collide. Elvis had been unfaithful for years, but when she slipped, he didn't just get upset, he spun out. Priscilla says the whole thing turned tense fast. Instead of having a conversation like two adults with a newborn on the way, he tried to reassert control, telling her, "That's how a real man makes love to his woman." It was less romance and more power play, and it showed just how shaky everything had become behind closed doors. But it didn't stop there. Once the news settled in, Elvis became obsessed, replaying the betrayal until he worked himself into a full meltdown. This was the same man who'd been juggling girlfriends on tour. But the idea of Priscilla having even one moment with someone else pushed him over the edge. At one point, he was storming around with a weapon, telling his bodyguard Sonny West that Mike Stone must die, and that Sonny would be the one to do it. That's where his head was, heartbroken, unhinged, and drowning in the cocktail of pills and pressure he was living on. Thankfully, the people around him talked him down before anything actually happened. But the fact that it escalated that far shows just how unstable things had become. Elvis's affairs were rock star behavior, but Priscilla's tiny sliver of independence? That was the thing that shattered the illusion of control he'd kept over her since she was 14. The both of them broke vows in different ways. Elvis through excess, and Priscilla through wanting to feel like a person again. But it was the collision of those two stories that really marked the beginning of the end. By the time the early 1970s rolled around, she wasn't angry. She was just empty. And emptiness is different from anger. It was during these years that Priscilla began cultivating her own identity in subtle but profound ways. Besides karate, she joined dance classes and discovered hobbies and passions that weren't dictated by Elvis's whims or schedule. This was the first time she had ever taken space for herself, space to breathe, to grow, to remember that she was a person in her own right, not just a reflection of the king. And with each small act of independence, something shifted in her. It was no longer about rebellion. It wasn't about leaving yet. It was about noticing herself again, the person she had been before fame, before Graceland, before she was cast into the role of quiet supporter, always in the background. That spark of autonomy, so small at first, grew into a quiet insistence that she could no longer ignore. The realization. By 1972, the realization had hardened into action. Priscilla understood that she couldn't keep living in the shadow of Elvis's world. She needed to reclaim herself, to breathe, live, and perhaps for the first time ever, as her own person. She told Elvis she was leaving. And here's the thing, he didn't fight her. He didn't scream, he didn't slam doors, he didn't try to manipulate her back. He just understood, because deep down, he had known all along that the marriage wasn't a marriage anymore. He had lost her long before she packed a single suitcase. But here's where it gets more complicated. Even after the separation and divorce, Priscilla didn't become an enemy, and neither did Elvis. Their divorce was finalized in October 1973. Yet they literally walked out of the courthouse holding hands. Holding hands! If that doesn't tell you how tangled, tender, and complicated this story was, nothing will. They co-parented Lisa Marie, they stayed in touch and remained emotionally connected. The romantic part of their relationship had ended, but the history, the bond, the connection, that never disappeared. Priscilla remained in Elvis's life until his death in 1977. Not as the girl he first met, not as the wife who had tried to mold herself into his world, but as someone who had finally discovered herself outside his shadow, loving him from a distance on her own terms. And after all of that, after the love, the loss, and the silence, what did Priscilla finally admit in ways she could never admit while living in his world? Finding her voice. After the divorce, Priscilla finally had space to breathe and think and feel, to untangle herself from the shadow of a man who had dominated her life for more than a decade. And with that space came clarity. She wrote several books like Elvis and Me, and that became her megaphone, giving readers a view of the quiet suffocation behind the sequins and rhinestones. She could finally look back at the relationship and speak honestly about what it had been like to grow up in Elvis's orbit. Not the polished Hollywood version everyone loved to see, with sequined jumpsuits and spotlight smiles, but the messy, complicated truth. Priscilla has always been careful with her words, but once free, she began to tell the story her younger self could never have. She described feeling invisible for years, subsumed into a life that wasn't really hers. The constant attention to Elvis's needs, the demands of fame, the endless parade of people orbiting around him, it all left little room for her own wants, her own voice. She talked about the ways she had tried to fill that emptiness, learning karate, taking dance lessons, exploring hobbies that were hers alone. And she admitted, without shame, that for the first time in her life, she was living for herself. That spark of independence wasn't just about leaving Elvis. It was about reclaiming the parts of herself that had been buried since she was 14, the parts of herself that had been told to stay quiet, stay small, and stay in line. Priscilla also reflected on the love she still felt for Elvis. She never claimed it went away, not entirely. She called him the love of her life, even decades later, but she made it clear that love wasn't enough. It had to coexist with respect, partnership, and space to be an individual. And in that marriage, none of those things had truly existed for her. Through her books, interviews, and rare public statements, she peeled back the myth of Elvis the perfect husband and revealed the loneliness and pressure, the subtle ways she had been molded and controlled, the quiet sacrifices she had made. And yet she did it with nuance. She didn't vilify him, didn't reduce their years together to scandal or grievance. Instead, she told the truth about living in the shadow of a superstar, about the cost of loving someone so all-consuming, and about the journey it took to find herself again. Even in her reflections, there's tenderness. She remembers the laughter, the kindness, the small moments of connection. But she also acknowledges the parts that broke her, forced her to grow, and eventually set her free. That honesty, the courage to speak after years of silence, is what makes Priscilla's story resonate so powerfully. Life after the king. When Elvis Presley died in 1977, the world mourned the king of rock and roll with a grief loud enough to echo across generations. Priscilla mourned too, but her grief was quieter, deeper, and far more complicated. Even though they had been divorced for 4 years, she never truly left his orbit. Emotionally, socially, and historically, she remained tied to him in ways the public could never fully understand. Losing him wasn't just losing an ex-husband. It felt like losing part of her identity, her past, and a chapter of her life that had defined her for so long. She later admitted that it felt like wanting to die, like the world had suddenly become emptier, colder, and unbearably quiet. But grief, for all its heaviness, can sharpen perspective. And for Priscilla, clarity arrived with action. She didn't retreat into the background or cling to old memories. She moved forward. Her first step was acting, not as a novelty, not as Elvis's widow stepping into Hollywood, but as a woman ready to claim her own spotlight. In 1983, she starred in the TV movie Love Is Forever. For some, it may have seemed like a modest beginning, but for her, it was liberation. Standing before the camera as herself, making choices that were hers alone. She followed that with her role as Jenna Wade on Dallas, one of the most watched shows in America. Suddenly, she wasn't just the girl Elvis married. She was compelling, talented, and confident, proving she could command attention without the king's shadow looming behind her. Then came the iconic Naked Gun films, where she surprised audiences with her comic timing and her ability to lean into camp with effortless charm. Hollywood started to understand that Priscilla Presley wasn't a relic of Elvis's world. She was an entertainer in her own right. Appearances on Melrose Place and Spin City added to the growing realization that she could show up, deliver, and leave audiences wanting more. But her evolution didn't stop at acting. Priscilla stepped into one of the most demanding roles imaginable: businesswoman and guardian of the Presley legacy. When Elvis's father passed away, she became executor of the estate, responsible for preserving not just a musician's property, but an international cultural phenomenon. Graceland wasn't just a mansion, it was a shrine, a business, and a pilgrimage site for millions. She had to navigate merchandise, tours, licensing, media storms, and expectations from a fan base that bordered on mythic devotion. And she handled it all with a balance of integrity, intelligence, and respect. She wasn't just trying to make the estate profitable. She was protecting Elvis's memory, preserving history, and safeguarding Lisa Marie's future. It was a tightrope walk. Maintain the myth without cheapening it, tell the truth without destroying it. She pulled it off with remarkable grace. During this time, she was rebuilding herself too. She grew into a woman capable of speaking openly about her life with Elvis while remaining dignified, measured, and never vindictive. She crafted her narrative on her own terms. She became a steady mother, guiding Lisa Marie through fame, heartbreak, and the crushing weight of the Presley name. She lived, laughed, and learned to find joy even within the strange, relentless world of Elvis's enduring legacy. So when people ask what Priscilla Presley did after Elvis, the answer is simple. She survived him, grew beyond him, and became a powerful force entirely on her own. She emerged as a woman defined not by a king's shadow, but by her own strength, wisdom, and undeniable resilience. She proved that you can love a legend and still build a life that is entirely your own. Priscilla's journey, from young bride to independent woman, reveals a life of love, loss, and self-discovery beyond the king's shadow. Did she ultimately find what she deserved, or was it too late? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dive stories coming soon here.